Now, before we get going on this, one thing you do need to know is what is patronage? Okay, now hopefully you've already kind of seen that, looked it up, done it on your Frere, something along those lines. But patronage is when you have a political party come into office and they essentially would go through and fire everybody from the opposing political party. And this was the same for Republicans and Democrats. It didn't matter. Either side would come in, they'd win an election. Let's say it was for, city government of some kind. Okay, we'll say it's in New York. And the Democrats win the election. They go through, they would fire every single one of the Republicans that they could. They would then replace them with their own people. Now, don't be concerned because as soon as Republicans won an election down the line, they would do the exact same thing. Patronage was repaying perceived party loyalty or loyalty to a particular individual by giving them some kind of a job, especially in the civil service. Okay, so the civil service, these are the people who actually run the government. They're the ones who do all the paperwork. If you're to call Social Security or the IRS, the people that you talk to on the phone, those are the civil servants. And the thing is, with patronage, replacing people every election and just firing everybody who may or may not be competent at their job and replacing them with someone who may not be competent at that job, that is a recipe for disaster. You're going to have corruption and incompetence and all sorts of issues come up. And so it had been for decades. Presidents had complained about the problem of patronage. Now, some presidents were upset that they weren't able to get their people in, or what was even worse, Abraham Lincoln, for example, was beset by office seekers, people who thought they were owed, fill in the blank. And so a lot of presidents wanted to fix the problem because of the incompetence and because of the general issues that were coming up and causing them grief in their own presidencies. So a number of presidents had complained about the problem. However, the question is, what do you actually do about it? Remember, the various bosses of the political machines had a great deal of influence because of the number of votes they controlled. And so while there were a lot of presidents very upset by the problem of patronage and corruption and things like that, not a lot of presidents were actually willing to, as the saying goes, take the bull by the horns and really fight the problem. Now, remember, patronage, for just a definition, the giving of government jobs to people of the same party who helped a candidate win. And in some cases, this was, okay because you got competent people. But that was the exception to the rule, unfortunately. Now, we still have something similar to this today. If a president, wins, they come in, there are a number of what are referred to as political appointees. These are the people who actually run the different portions of government. Okay, they're the ones who are in charge. However, they're not the ones who run the day-to-day. Those are career civil servants now. But let's say a president comes into office and that individual can reward folks who have been loyal to the party or done particular work for their party or something like that by giving them jobs such as, say, being an ambassador, or they can be, say the postmaster general or the head of the Federal Communications Commission, things like that. Jobs that look good and are important but don't, actually require civil service work per se. So again, those are the kind of jobs we're talking about here. Jobs that are given just because somebody helped a candidate win. And remember, I said before, as a result of all this, you had a lot of unqualified and corrupt workers were hired. And when you have unqualified and corrupt people running your government, you are not going to have a good run. You're going to have people upset. You are going to have problems galore that are going to just keep building one upon another. And a president is eventually going to literally be drowned in all the problems and issues of this corruption. Sometimes a president would get blamed for the corruption, even though really he didn't have anything to do with it, wasn't benefiting from the corruption, but still was tainted. Best example of that would be U.S. Grant. Okay, he was an honest guy. It's just the people that he had around him tended to be, for lack of a better term, dishonest dirtbags. So, these things do happen. So with the patronage system, you have unqualified corrupt workers running your government for you. And you can see this is going to be a problem. Now, the reformers, I mentioned that, they wanted to end the patronage system. There were those who thought that the way things had worked for the longest time, and really this had started back in the 1830s under President Andrew Jackson. So it had been going on for, 50 plus years at this point, 40, 50 years. And there were those who wanted to fix the issue. They wanted to go through and they wanted to change the way things were being done in government. They actually wanted, it's going to come as a shock, qualified people to actually run the various aspects of government. So there were reformers out there that wanted to end this patronage system. What they wanted was something often referred to as a meritocracy. Okay? They called for a merit-based system in which you have the various jobs in government are going to actually go to the people who are qualified to do the job. You're going to hire people that actually know what they're doing. They're not there to line their own pockets and make a ton of money. They're there to do some kind of good, to actually help people with the issues of government and things like that. And this is essentially what we have today. We have a merit-based system. But back in this time, there was a lot of controversy over this because both parties benefited from being able to put their people into government jobs. It meant that you had more people willing to work quite harder to get your guy elected because they knew it meant they would get some kind of a job. A lot of people looked at this as it gave people a vested interest in going through and getting a particular individual elected because it meant that they knew they would be having a job. Now, one president who actually did try to get the ball rolling in regard to civil service reform was a guy by the name of Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, Rutherford B. Hayes is a president who has some difficulties. He's the first president who actually had more votes in the Electoral College than he did in the popular vote. So he didn't win the popular vote, so people didn't like that. There were a lot of irregularities in his elections, so there's a great question as to the legitimacy of his presidency, to the point that he was sometimes referred to as Rutherford B. Hayes, or sometimes he would just be referred to as his fraudulency. He wanted to reform the civil service. He wanted to go through and get rid of the patronage. He wanted it to be a merit-based system. But the problem is his own party. Now Rutherford B. Hayes was a Republican, and there was a group of Republicans in New York referred to as the stalwarts around this time, and they were a political machine, and they did not want to give up that power. And New York was one of the most powerful bases for politics at that time. As a result, even though Rutherford B. Hayes wanted to go through and wanted to reform the system, and he wanted to change it to merit-based, he wasn't going to get any help from the Democrats on the other side, and he wasn't going to get any help from his own party. So he was pretty much out on a limb on this one and was unable to actually accomplish anything in regards to his goals. In fact, this issue of patronage is actually going to end up dividing the Republican Party, believe it or not. They are going to have two very, very devout, for lack of a better term, wings within the Republican Party. One wants to keep everything the way it was. One wants to go through and make the necessary changes. So the issue of patronage is going to cause a big shakeup within the party itself. Now, I mentioned before, on the one side, you have what are known as the stalwarts. Okay, the stalwarts opposed changes of any kind. They liked the patronage system. They saw it as benefiting them and their party. And when I say them, there were those stalwarts who were making a good living as a direct result of patronage. So they didn't want anything to change. They didn't mind the corruption. They didn't mind the incompetence, because they were benefiting from it, okay? So the stalwarts, they want to keep everything exactly as it is. The other side, you have the reformers. The reformers wanted to go through and they wanted to change things. They feel that the corruption and the incompetence and everything is causing more harm than good. They don't really worry so much about what it would do to portions of the party or the party in general, but they're looking at it more as a moral responsibility, that it's something that needs to be changed. It's something that they need to go through and they need to fix for the future. So eventually, The party goes through and they decide on a more independent candidate, a gentleman by the name of James A. Garfield. Now, Garfield, not really a big pusher of reforms, nor a big desirer of keeping everything exactly the way it was. This was sort of a compromise candidate, for lack of a better term. This was somebody that neither side was enthused about, but both sides were looked at him as, all right, it's good enough, and things like that. Now, the problem was, in the election that elected James Garfield, there was an individual who had spent a great deal of time hanging out at Republican Party headquarters, and when all was said and done, felt that he had earned a position through the course of patronage. The guy's name was Charles Guiteau, and he had helped out during the presidential campaign, thought he was owed a job. I believe he wanted to be Postmaster General. He had actually met with the president. The president referred him to a guy named Blaine, from a powerful Republican from Maine at the time, and saw this guy as incompetent and didn't give him a job. Now, the problem with that is Guiteau then thought that he was being brushed off because he was, part of the stalwart faction, began fantasizing about killing the president, and actually ended up shooting him twice. Once was a minor shot in the arm, the other went into his back. And unfortunately for James Garfield, not only did the shot prove fatal, it took 2 months for the man to die. So Garfield was assassinated by the stalwart Guiteau. He is reported to have said after shooting the president that I am a stalwart and Arthur will be president. Chester A. Arthur was Garfield's vice president and was a strong member of the stalwart faction. In fact, he was best friends with Roscoe P. Conklin, who was the head of the stalwarts. And so Garfield is assassinated. He is shot, and it takes 2 months for him to die. Chester A. Arthur then becomes president of the United States. Okay, now the surprise about Chester A. Arthur is that this is a guy who was a stalwart. He was a member of that faction, yet he turned out to be one of the greatest reformers civil service had ever seen. Okay, this was not what was expected. The stalwarts thought that they had a pretty easy go now that one of their own was president. But somebody pointed out that, well, he's no longer Chet Arthur, he's now the president. And in fact, it was President Arthur who pushed through what's a piece of legislation known as the Pendleton Civil Service Act, and this was back in 1883. Remember, the Republican Party had been split on the issue of patronage. But Chester A. Arthur, after he becomes president, becomes a very, very concerted reformer, working very hard on this. And so as the Pendleton Civil Service Act goes through the Congress and finally arrives on his desk, he signs it into law. Now remember, we said the reformers wanted to go through and create a meritocracy, and that's exactly what this did. The civil service was now going to be based on merit. Did you actually have the ability to do the job for which you're going to get paid? It set up civil service reforms like, having to go through and take a test if you want to be part of the civil service. You get promoted if you're actually competent at your job. You don't get a job or you don't get promoted simply because you know somebody. That kind of thing. The civil service, the actual running of the various portions of our government, is now going to be based on merit. We're actually going to have competent people who are not there just trying to make a buck. Now, are there still going to be dishonest people who are doing dishonest things? Of course, human nature is what human nature is, and we are always going to have individuals like that. But now at least we have the fighting chance that the civil service is going to be set up a little better. We're going to have a better chance at actually having a functioning government that is much less corrupt and much less incompetent. At least we have, like I said, a fighting chance now. The grand result of all this, though, you can argue had mixed results. Okay, generally speaking, we as a nation very rarely have legislation that turns into law that everything is perfect, that there's never another issue, that we all link arms and sing kumbaya and everybody gets a puppy. It's not often that way. Usually when we pass legislation, the old saying is you got to take the bitter with the sweet. So this did have some mixed results. For example, on the plus side, we definitely have more qualified workers filling our government positions now. You have people who are going to be able to be there longer. You have people who actually know what they're doing and are competent at their jobs, will move further up the ladder and therefore have more responsibilities and be able to run a bigger portion. So that is a definite plus. Generally speaking, you think about it, if you own a business, do you want to hire someone who is qualified and will do a good job, or do you want someone who has no clue what they're doing and continuously screws up? Most people are going to say they want to hire somebody who actually is able to do their job. So this is a plus. We do have more qualified workers filling these various government positions. Another thing that was good about this, it prevented politicians from seeking money from their supporters. It used to be that you would go through and you would donate a ton of money to particular politicians, and then that guaranteed you some kind of cushy, not really even working job with the government afterwards. Well, now you're going to have, that is really going to stop. The politicians are not going to have the same ability to promise jobs that they once did, so there's not going to be the same, reasoning to give politicians a ton of money. Now, again, are there still going to be those people who try to get as much money to a politician as possible with the theory that they're now going to own that politician? Absolutely. That has been the bane of politics for generations and probably will still keep going that way. But at least now, again, we're starting to see some changes. We're starting to see that politicians aren't really able to, for lack of a better term, kind of auction off the job to whoever had donated the most money to their campaign. The problem with this is it did turn some politicians to particular wealth leaders for support. You had different politicians now going to individuals of great means, people who had a lot of money, and they were trying to get their support. Now, that same thing happens today in 2020. You still have people going to various donors to try and get support for their campaigns. And again, this is one of those things that will continue on, I'm pretty sure, until politics no longer exists. But this was one of the drawbacks, that you did have, instead of auctioning off the job, as I said, now you have politicians going to particular individuals that had a lot of money. And that meant that now these people who were donating the money to the politicians were now going to have considerably more influence over these particular politicians. Sometimes for good, sometimes, for ill. It just would all depend, and we're still looking at the results of all this, more than a century later.